Hello, and welcome to APICS Extra Live, the 7 macro developments reshaping supply chain management with Dr. Stephen A. Melnick. My name is Jennifer Pirelli, Associate Editor at APICS. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. At the end of the presentation, we will save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click Send. If you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar Tech Support at 1-805-617-7000. Again, that's 1-805-617-7000. This presentation is being recorded and will be available at apics.org/extralive early next week. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Stephen A. Melnick is a professor of operations management within the Eli Broad College of Business at Michigan State University. Stephen and his fellow faculty currently are working with the APICS Supply Chain Council on the Supply Chain Management Beyond the Horizon research project, which considers the current and future trends impacting supply chain management. Updates about this project are available in the Beyond the Horizon department of APICS Magazine, which is available in print, online, and in the APICS Magazine tablet app. Everybody, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Stephen A. Melnick. Steve, you may begin.
Welcome. And as Jennifer pointed out, my name is Stephen A. Melnick. And if you'd like to talk to me about this, or you have any questions, or anything you'd like to do to share the thoughts or what you see, please feel free to call me at 517-432-6410, or else email me at melnick@msu.edu. Now, before I begin, let me tell you what we're going to be doing. We're going to be forecasting. And as every production operations manager knows, we know that there are 3 laws that govern forecasting. The first is all forecasts are wrong. That goes without saying. The second is all forecasts change. And the third, and the one that we tend to remember, is that we're all held accountable for accuracy. Let me introduce you to this gentleman right here who has, I think, a good final word on forecasting. His name is Niels Bohr. Now, who is Niels Bohr? He is a past Nobel Prize winner in physics, and one day when he was asked about forecasting in the future, he said, "Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future." And by the way, as you kind of got this, one of the things that we come out to is that if you forecast, ultimately, you are going to be doing a bit of lying. So just to let you know up front, truth in advertising, I will be lying to you. One question we're going to ask is, we're going to now begin with the forecasting. Why is it so important that we forecast? And I think it gets back to the nature of supply chain management. So, in the sense that in supply chain management, we find that there are certain things that take place. And what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about 7 developments which I've identified, and the people in the Beyond the Horizon have identified, as having a significant impact on the future, potential future of supply chain management. What are they? The first is the aging of developed countries. The second is energy volatility. The third is the shift of purchasing power to the east. The fourth is the Internet of Things. The fifth is the experiential supply chain. The sixth is autonomous and digital technology. And finally, we're going to talk about cybersecurity. Well, why should we be concerned about the future? Well, there's a fundamental reality of supply chain that every manager knows, and what is that? The first thing is that today's supply chain is a result of investments we've made in the past. That is, what we've done in the past has shaped what we can and cannot do today, which means that tomorrow's supply chain will be the result of investments we make today. Now, here's the reality. If we're dealing with this, what we have to recognize is because it takes time to shape, change, build a supply chain, we have to forecast, because forecasting affects how we invest. Well, let's talk a bit about some of these developments. The first one I want to focus on is the aging of developed countries. Let me share with you something that I was introduced to last year at the Supply Chain Strategic Summit in Chicago. There was a presentation by a person from MIT who pointed out that if you look at the world and you look at currently 2000, what they pointed out is that Europe is now experiencing a situation where a significant percentage of becoming aged. Well, if we project this forward to 20, I want you to look at this map and look at the scale. Notice the percentage of the workforce. It's going to be 30, that's going to be 50, it's going to be 55 or older. And look at North America, look at Europe, look at China, look at Australia. In fact, there was a recent UN study which found that by the year 2050, over 50% of the population in Europe will be 55 or older. So what does this mean? Well, it really, to get you an idea, compare this and look at what's happening between today and 2050. Look at the percentage of the population that's going to be over 65. This is going to have a major impact on the supply chain. And we're going to explore that in a minute. Now, by the way, one of the things we're going to do in this presentation is we're going to start by introducing the various trends. And then afterwards, we're going to discuss the implications. So if you can bear with me, I think you'll find some really interesting insights. Well, the second issue is energy volatility. Right now, everyone knows that we're in a period of an energy low spot. I teach a course for the Rotterdam School of Management, and this January, when I was over there in the Netherlands, a lot of the people who are taking executive MBAs work with the energy industry. And the one thing they kept on talking about was the extent to which they couldn't invest because of the fact that the energy prices have fallen, the floor of the energy prices has fallen. Well, if you look at what's been happening over time, it's important to understand we're going through a cycle. But what's interesting is the pattern. There's a lot of volatility about energy. And this is going to have a major impact on the supply chain because currently our supply chains tend to be global. And if you think about this, this means that there's a potential impact in the sense of how we think, how we design, how we develop, and how we implement these supply chains. Then there's a shifting power, purchasing power to the east. What I want you to do is to look at this diagram. In it, there's a number of trends that are very pronounced. The first thing I want you to look at is what's happening to countries like Germany, what's happening to Japan, what's happening to the European Union, and then you've got the United States. And what this is talking about is the percentage of the world gross domestic product. What's interesting is right here. Notice what's happening. China is growing, and it's growing not simply as a supplier, it's growing as a market. Now that's going to be important because some of us have supply chains which are anchored in China. And increasingly we're starting to see that the supply chains that are developed in China are not really developed for serving demand elsewhere, but they're being developed to service demand in China. Good example is BMW, Volkswagen. When they introduced supply chains in China, they were doing it because they expected to serve the Chinese market. Now, what's also interesting is along with this, there is another trend, which is if you look at what's happening in terms of military spending, the Chinese are increasing. And in fact, what's interesting is China is now approximating, is getting close to the amount that the United States spends as a percentage of its GDP. Well, that's all great. But then there's some stuff that's taking place technologically, which is really exciting. How many of you have heard this concept called the Internet of Things? Well, when I initially heard about it, I wasn't too excited. You know, it sounded kind of neat, it sounded different. But then I started to ask, what is this thing called the Internet of Things? Well, let me give you some of the things to think about. We are now living in an environment where most of us are carrying one or more smart devices. Now, what do we mean by smart devices? These are devices which can do more than one thing. They're also hooked to the internet. They're interrelated. They're linked. Now, what's exciting is these devices can start to talk to each other. They can start to monitor us. They can start to monitor our environment. I'll give you an example. How many of you out there have a Fitbit exercise band? I've got one on my wrist right now, and what it's doing is not only monitoring the steps I take, it's also monitoring my heartbeat, the percentage of time I spend sleeping, the percentage of time I spend walking, the percentage of time my blood pressure, my heart rate is elevated. What's interesting is there is a growth in these smart devices. What's interesting is they're not simply independent, they're linked. Now, just to give you an idea of the growth. A recent study has pointed out that currently, by the year 2020, we will have 4 billion people who will be connected. That is, through their smart devices, they're going to be connected to others and to the internet. There is an estimate that this represents a $4 trillion revenue opportunity, that there will be over 25 plus million applications which rely on these smart devices. There will be 25 billion plus embedded in intelligent systems. And here's the big kicker. By 2020, we will be regularly generating over 50 trillion gigabytes of data. We are going to be living in one of the most interconnected ages ever. Here's a statistic that was shared with me by one person who pointed out that currently, by the time 2020 occurs, every person on the world will have between 6 to 7 smart devices on themselves. So what? Well, let's just kind of figure out what's going on. So what's the Internet of Things? It's the network of physical objects or things that are embedded with software, sensors, and network connectivity that enable the Internet of Things, the IoT, to collect, exchange, and analyze data. So what does this mean? Well, this includes things like smartphones, sensors in cars, equipment, appliances, fitness monitors, smartwatches, product tags. In fact, at the recent Detroit Auto Show, they unveiled, Mercedes unveiled the 2017 Mercedes-Benz E350, which was described as the most interconnected car ever built. And we're going to see in a minute why that's so important. What else is important? Now think about this. By the year 2020, we will have over 201 billion devices talking to each other. So how does this affect us? Well, let's give some examples. There's a company called HydroPoint, which manages data usage, and they developed a system called WeatherTrack. They currently have over 25,000 subscribers, and what they've been able to do is they've been able to save through these smart devices, and this is in California, over 20 billion gallons of water, 77 million kilowatts of electricity, and over $143 million. How many of you have heard of Pirelli? Pirelli, the tire people. Pirelli's now been experimenting with smart devices. What they've been doing with the smart devices is they have been embedding them in their tires and selling these smart tires to some of their commercial customers. Now, why would they do that? Well, they're doing it because for Pirelli, it's important. It's a way for them to learn about the durability and performance of its products. Instead of you asking the customer how does he drive the car or the truck, what I'm doing instead is I've got these smart devices in the tire itself, and they can monitor the speed, the duration, whether it's abrupt stopping or not, so they can get a better idea of how people use their products. What's really exciting for Pirelli is that this has enabled them to offer their customers a new service in the form of vehicle protection and control. How's that? Sorry. Well, the answer, sorry about that. Wrong one. Anyway, the answer to that is very simple. Because what Pirelli is now doing is through vehicle control and protection, what it's doing is it can track where vehicles are. It can see where they're being used and where they're located. So if somebody steals your truck, guess what? They may be able to find a sensor inside, but it's kind of hard to drive a truck without 4 tires. And for the people within Pirelli and for its customers, they can now find out whether products are being used as expected or are they being abused by their users. Well, I was talking recently with someone from Ford, and he came up with a great term, and I had to ask him about it. And he started to talk about gossiping cars. It was like cars talking to each other. What's going on here? Well, what he suggested and what he did is, at this time, we saw an ad campaign by Verizon. Now, what you're seeing in the lower left corner of your screen is the Verizon Hum system. Now, what is it? It's a little module that fits into the monitoring outlet port in your car. Every car has it. This is the port that your mechanic now plugs in order to find out when you get an error code what's going on. Now think about what's going on here. This Hum, and why this is such an unusual product, is because this product is not simply talking with respect to you, that is telling you, interpreting what the codes are. It's going one step further. It's helping you understand what they mean, plus it's talking with the internet. Why is that so important? If you have an accident, it'll tell people. If you have a breakdown, it'll tell the system. So now what's happening is we're starting to see this notion of vehicles not simply communicating with you, the driver, but they're communicating with others. So what does this have to do with this concept of gossiping cars? Well, think about this. As we move forward, we're going to see more and more of these smart devices implanted in our cars. This means that cars can talk to each other. Now, everyone here, probably most of you have heard of Waze. It's one of those great applications that enables you when you're driving to figure out what's going down. But in order for Waze to work, somebody has to input the information. This is different. Imagine that you're going for a drive. In my case, supposing I'm going from East Lansing, Michigan to Detroit. I've got to go pick up a flight at DTW. Well, as I'm driving down the road, what my car can now do is it can start to query cars down the road to see what's happening. It can look for average speed. It can look for stoppages. And now suddenly, if I have a problem, I can find out in advance and I can look for an alternative route. Now let's think about why are car companies so interested in this? Well, think about if you're Ford or GM or you're Chrysler or Honda or Toyota. Well, what I can now do is I can see how people drive my product, use my product. I can look at to see whether or not there are problems which in isolation don't seem to be important, but when I aggregate things, they become critical. So suddenly what I can do is I can identify potential problem in designs. I can look at features or factors I have to consider when I design my product. The real impact is if you're on a lean system. You've got a product or a truck coming in on a lean delivery. In the past, what you have to do is you'd give them a window and you expect people to arrive. Now what are you doing? You're querying the system and having the trucks themselves tell you where they are, and you can predict the probability of them meeting their scheduled delivery dates. So from this perspective, it is an amazing affair. And this is why Ford's interested. This is going to give Ford the ability to identify and improve quality. And by the way, for logistics companies, can be critical. Well, I'm going to introduce you to the fifth development, the experiential supply chain. What's the experiential supply chain? And this we're going to call it also the personalized supply chain. In order to discuss this, I'm going to take you somewhere. I'm going to take you to Seattle, Washington. Recently, in December 7th, I was attending a conference from one of the professional societies, and I had a chance to visit the new Starbucks. It's the Starbucks Reserve Roastery and Tasting Room. This represents the new generation of Starbucks. Now, what's ironic is it's 9 blocks away from the original Starbucks. And this is Starbucks reimagining what they're going to look like. Now, what do you see when you walk in the door? It's a totally different experience. I'm going to ask you to be aware of this. This is a roasting machine. What's unique about this Starbucks is that the supply chain, the process of developing products, is highly visible to the customer. And in fact, what's interesting about it is they have blends that you wouldn't expect to see elsewhere. And in fact, they announced them in this fashion. And this is using a European-style arrival board. And what's interesting about it? What's interesting is this is what you see if you turn around and look from the area where the coffee is developed, is brewed. This is what you see. You see a full-fledged roasting room. And why are they doing this? Because what Starbucks has recognized is that people no longer want the coffee. They want the experience. They want to be part of it. They want to see how the coffee is prepared, how it's roasted, how it's ground, how it's delivered. In fact, what's interesting about this place, the Starbucks Reserve, is that they can prepare coffee in 5 different ways. And in every case, it is the experience. You're not simply sitting there and getting a cup of coffee. You're part of it. In my case, I sat down and I was intrigued by this concept of siphon coffee. The person who prepared it for me took 5 minutes to do it. Over that 5 minutes, he described the process, and I learned that this was a process developed in the 1840s. It is the oldest method of making coffee using the alternative processes. And what he did is he described it, he walked me through the process, and then he poured the coffee out for me, and it was different. But what was unique is that I had a chance to participate and to be part of it. So this is what we see. We see the coffee room, we see the grinder, and then we experience it. And what's important about this? Well, what's important is this is not unique to Starbucks. Starbucks is recognizing that today's consumer wants to understand the origins of the products they consume. Now, what was ironic about this special is, as we were preparing for this presentation, PBS, Public Broadcasting, had a special about coffee. And in the special, they had the executive vice president of marketing for Starbucks, who made a statement which was profound. And what he said is, increasingly, today's customers want to know the provenance of the products they consume. It's no longer enough to give them the product. They want to know the origins. They want to know where it's made. People want that visibility. It's now present in Starbucks. It's present in some new food services, things like Blue Apron, MTurk, and the such. And what's going on in these products, in these systems, is that in the case of Blue Apron, what's happening is you work with a chef online to develop a menu. That menu is then customized for your family. Once you develop the menu, you place the order. A box arrives with all of the ingredients being locally sourced. It's not cooked, but instead what you have is recipes and instructions. And what they're selling, what Blue Apron, what Plated, and others are selling, they're not selling the finished meal, they're selling the experience of you sitting there with your family and cooking the meal, with the assurance that every meal is going to take between 30 to 40 minutes, no more than 40. Now, why is this so important? I raised this issue with one of my colleagues in marketing. And when I described this to him, he said, you know what you've got going on here? And of course, being myself, I said, no. Remember, I'm a supply chain, and people in supply chains treat people in marketing as with some degree of suspicion. He said, what you've got is the emergence of the market of one. And I said to myself, that's neat, because if in lean production, our goal is to move towards an order quantity of one, then if we're dealing with lean systems, with this experiential supply chain, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with a new type of market, a market where our market size is not a segment, it's a unique customer, where the level of customization and customer service are so high that the customer feels that he or she is an exclusive or preferred customer of the firm. Now, if you think about that, that's a powerful vision. It's like what we see in Amazon, where they feel whenever there's a problem, a need, an issue, they're the first people they turn to. Good example, I was looking for some stuff to clean my sofa. And what did I do? I went to Amazon. That's the market of one. And this is one where, more importantly, the supply chain is highly visible. Now, as soon as we do that, we start to see something else occur, and that is the autonomous or digital technologies, the sixth major development. What's going on here? Well, everyone knows about 3D printing. By the way, 3D printing continues to evolve and develop. Last year in May, for example, MIT introduced a process whereby you could 3D print glass. I was told by one of my colleagues who went to the technology show in Munich, Germany, that one of the companies had introduced a process for 3D printing pizza. What this means is that we can delay production. We no longer have to wait for things. We no longer have to build in batch in advance. We can build on demand. Now let me give you something else that's taking place. This picture comes courtesy of Mercedes-Benz. It's the new Mercedes-Benz truck. It's one of the first autonomous trucks in the world, self-driving. Now, why is this important? There's several reasons. First of all, everyone knows about the labor shortage in terms of truck drivers. The second thing this does, too, is it recognizes that for much of the distance, truck driving is boring. The only time you really need a truck driver is during difficult weather or in the city. Now, what's interesting about autonomous or self-driving vehicles is they're now building the technology using, remember, the Internet of Things? If you have two self-driving trucks, they can talk to each other, and what can happen is one can come up behind the other, and they can form a train. Now, what's interesting about that train? That train is fuel efficient. And so what's happening now is we're starting to see a development whereby 3D printing, autonomous self-driving cars, and by the way, Elon Musk has made a statement that by 2020, almost all cars on the road will have the capability to be self-driving. And we're starting to see that. Good example, I just picked up a Mercedes-Benz for myself last year, and I found out that the car is smarter than I am. It'll warn me, tell me when I'm starting to drift out of lane. So, what's this going to mean? This comes to the final element, cybersecurity. What's cybersecurity? Why is it so important? Well, let's understand something. Supply chains are ultimately information-rich environments. What do? We pass a lot of information. What type? We pass information about schedules, consumer data, design, strategic plans. And often this information is sensitive, it's critical, and it's often shared amongst the partners in the supply chain. By the way, it's now open to threat from outside. We're starting to find that this threat's coming from multiple sources. It's coming from governments, companies, individuals. It's coming from groups which have an agenda. So what you're starting to see is that there are opportunities, there are threats. And how bad are these threats? Well, when I was looking to prepare for this presentation, I did a search through the internet and I came across a report. And the report asked a simple question. What percentage of organizations have experienced a cybersecurity breach? Now, by the way, this is a British report. And so what they found is, are you ready for this? 93% of large organizations experienced one form or other of a security breach. How about small to medium? They're not important. How about 87% of small businesses? Well, what was really interesting was this final statistic. 50%, this 93 and this 87 represented a 50% increase in the frequency of breaches from 2012. And by the way, the source of this report, and it's available online, is Cybersecurity Risks in the Supply Chain, CERT UK 2015. By the way, is it any coincidence that NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, has now put together a cybersecurity framework which it's using for managing security in the supply chain network? By the way, a little observation, they're concerned about security breaches as a technical issue. We're here looking at security breaches as a business strategic issue. By the way, why is this a concern to us? Well, what do you think is the weakest link in cybersecurity? Remember, hackers and those people are going to go after these. The answer is, you got it, the supply chain. How we share information with others. And so this becomes an important issue. By the way, here's a gentleman I'm sure all of you have seen or heard of, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple. And recently you were aware of what happened when Apple was asked to hack its own phones in order to reveal what the communication that was going on between the two people who were responsible for the San Bernardino massacre. Apple refused because it didn't want to compromise the security of information. And this has become an issue. If you've been watching what's been happening, the FBI has claimed now that they've been able to hack the Apple phone. Apple's now ramping up its security efforts. And once the FBI announced that they had hacked Apple's phones, many police departments have approached the FBI and asked for help in hacking their phones taken from suspects in order to resolve potential murders. All right, now we're coming to the fun part. What does this mean for supply chain management? Well, let's be honest. It's kind of obvious. Things are getting to be far more complex. In fact, not only complex, they're getting to be far more dynamic, turbulent, uncertain. As this cartoon says, this month's business meeting is the same as last month's business meeting, but with many more problems. That kind of describes what these 7 trends talk about. What are the implications? Let's talk about the aging of the population. The first thing that you can come up with is as people age, they tend to change what they want. As you reach retirement, you're not buying as much in terms of goods. You're now starting to buy more in terms of services. You're buying, for example, help with preparing things. Some of you may wind up living in assisted living facilities. But from a so this represents an important issue, but more importantly, there's a change in age and experience. Right now, most of us are experiencing the retirement of baby boomers. That generation was born between 1940 and 1963. What's so important? Well, what's happened is when the baby boomers leave, lots of their assets leave with them. What do we mean by that? Well, this means, number one, many of these are supply chain professionals. They're going away. It also means that there's a change in skill sets. If you look at baby boomers, people retiring, they're going to be replaced by millennials. Baby boomers, what are they good at? They have a longer term horizon. Baby boomers are willing to think in terms of years, whereas the millennials tend to be much more short-term oriented. There's also the experience that the baby boomers are taking with them. Experience which is difficult to replicate in the millennials. They also bring with them an awareness of the soft side, the behavioral issues. So what? Millennials, on the other hand, they tend to have a far shorter time horizon. In many cases, when talking about millennials, we hear a commonly used phrase that they want it now. They want to have self-gratification immediately. They are also much more quantitative. They feel comfortable with numbers. But notice, they need the skills that the baby boomers have. So there's not only a change in the number, there's a change in the composition of skills. What's the result? Well, I'm going to share with you something that occurred recently in Detroit. DHL, a major transportation company, produced a report, and the title was The Automotive Supply Chain Talent Crisis. And what they were arguing is, guess what? There is a supply chain talent crisis present. And by the way, what's really interesting about this crisis is not simply over the number of people, it's also a crisis in terms of the skill sets. Why is that? Recently, Deloitte produced a study asking managers, what are the critical skills you want out of their supply chain people? Well, of course, one of them was awareness of technological developments, the 7 macro traits. The second was familiarity, experience with the quantitative tools. But what do you think the first and most important set of skills that these people wanted? And this is, again, over 400 global CEOs talking about supply chain. The first and foremost set of skills were 2. Number 1, strategic thinking. What they were saying was, we have enough of people who can think at a operational level. What we need is people who can think about the supply chain as a strategic entity. The second thing that they pointed out was that we needed people who were critical thinkers and who were effective problem solvers. So what we're trying to say here is 2 things are taking place. There's a numbers game and there's a shift in skills. And these 2 factors can be directly attributed to the 7 traits that we discussed. Well, how about the issue? So we've talked about volatility, we've talked about China. What does that got to do with supply chain? Well, we need to develop new supply chain bases. Here's the reality. China is no longer a supply base for export. In fact, what's really becoming interesting is China is now using its supply chain as a way of competing, and it's also using its supply chain increasingly to satisfy a growing demand by the middle class for products. But there's something else going on. What we have to think about is we have to think about how do we build products quicker, shorter, closer to the market. One of the best examples of this is what's happening in Amazon. Amazon is now experimenting using 3D printing to build its products on board as they're being delivered. It's recognizing that the old model doesn't work. That is, you build in China, import it, because that model is very expensive. And if there are minor shifts in fuel prices, it throws the profitability off. So what's happening? They're trying to build closer to the market. What else is happening? As soon as we do that, something else takes place. We have spent a lot of time in supply chains talking about how do we work with others. And specifically, the others are within our own area. Well, the reality is, as we start to see these changes taking place, we're starting to think things become faster. By the way, to give you an idea, one of the bellwethers of this new supply chain model is Zara. Zara competes in the fashion business. How Zara competes is amazing. It doesn't compete on cost, it competes on time. Here's something to think about. The traditional fashion company thinks in terms of months from design to delivery. Zara thinks in terms of weeks and days. One statistic I heard shared with me was that no Zara product spends any more than 72 hours within the Zara warehouses. More importantly, whereas in the traditional fashion industry we've had 4 seasons, Zara has converted that to 104 seasons. It's not unusual for people to talk about Z days, which is when Zara introduces a new idea. And their customers are coming up. They're the new model. What does this mean? Well, if you think about this, it means we're going to have to be better at talking and working with marketing, far better at working with engineering. And we have to be better at working with strategy, which means it's no longer enough to have them understand our language. We have to speak in a way that we convey supply chain in terms they can understand. In essence, in finance too, in essence, the barriers between these areas and supply chain have to disappear. By the way, what this really starts to focus is, in the past, supply chain managers have been good about thinking about the supply chain, a capability. That's no longer the case. You know what the case is? We have to focus on how supply chain fits into the business model. And the business model brings together 3 elements. Who's our key customer? What's our value proposition? And here's where supply chain. Notice, this is not important. What's important is to what extent does what the customer expects, what we've promised, and what we can do, are they aligned? Because in that intersection, we see value. Well, okay, that's neat. Now so we have another issue. So what else is going on? Well, the rate of change that's taking place in supply chain is analogous to what happened to the United States Air Force in the Korean War. In 1952, the United States Air Force had a problem. It had what it considered to be the best fighter plane in the world, and that's what you see right there, the F-86 Sabre, flown by some of the best trained pilots in the world. You know what the problem was? If you looked at survival rates, it was very bimodal. There were 2 humps. You either got shot down very quickly or you survived for a good long time. So the Air Force was faced by a problem, because understand, from 1945, when most airplanes were piston-driven, to 1952, when those airplanes were jet-driven, there was a major technological change. You went from airplanes that flew at 400 miles per hour to airplanes that were flying at over 600 miles per hour, where the rate of closure between 2 fighters was 1,200 miles per hour. Things had changed. In order to solve this problem, they turned to a guy by the name of Colonel John R. Boyd. Let me introduce you to John Boyd. John Boyd was known as one of the most out-of-the-box thinkers in the United States Air Force. In fact, he has been recognized as having one of the biggest impacts on thinking in the United States Air Force of any person over this time period. When he looked at this problem, he came up with a simple observation. The people who got shut down quickly waited until the threat had become firm. They were able to positively identify it's the enemy. The problem was, by that time, it was too late. Instead, what he found was that the people who were highly successful were able to sense and identify potential threats, monitor them, and make a decision. In fact, he called this the OODA Loop, which stood for, it's OODA, stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. Well, that concept is very rang when I started to prepare this presentation. And what I did is I started to recast it as the strategic response cycle. Let me introduce the strategic response cycle. It begins with sensing new developments. That's what we have done in this presentation. Next thing is you assess, determine are they threats, how important, when. Formulate a response, then you move to deploy the response. Recalibrate means are the current goals or objectives still appropriate? If they're not, if they're no longer feasible, let's scale back. If we can surpass them easily, let's come up with a new set of goals. What did we learn from our last cycle? And let's repeat this. So essentially, what makes the strategic response cycle so attractive is companies have to do this. And we're starting to see this in beyond the horizon, where the good companies are implementing this cycle and they're doing something, they're doing it fast. As one manager said, I want to be 80% accurate. I don't need an optimal system. I need robust. I need to be able to move quickly. And that's what we're saying. In this age of turbulence, as these changes take place, the key is speed of response. And by the way, this is interesting because one of the things we noticed from beyond the horizon is an increasing focus on the future. In fact, one of the managers said, used the term forward-casting. What he meant by that is when we look at our objectives, we tend to look at the past. This is the objective. Why didn't you achieve it? What did you do wrong? And he said that's irrelevant. You can't do anything about the past. That's irrelevant. Instead, what he said is, let's look at the future goal. Is it still relevant? If not, how should it be changed? And then, are the current processes and resources enough? And if not, how do we change them? The goal is not the past. It's move forward to the future. And that's the key in today's presentation. The past is behind me. The future is in front of me. I can't do anything about the past, but I can sure do something about the future. So a final thought, and for those of you, we're coming to the end. This is an interesting statement, and it's a curse. And it says, may you live in interesting times. It's a Chinese curse. And the purpose is to say, in interesting times, things changed. Often the rules which worked before don't work well now. It was a time of change. And in many cases, it was a time of high uncertainty. Well, I'm going to have to share with you the same curse. We are now living in interesting times, which says the following. Well, what have we said from this presentation? Number one, the future will look different for supply chain management. That's obvious. Supply chains will now become more complex. And by the way, understand the difference between complex and complex and complicated. Complex is driven by the customer. Complicated is driven by us. It's what we do to make our life difficult. More strategic. We're going to have to move from the shop floor, the buying floor, the warehouse. We're going to have to move thinking about things strategically. More visible. Our customers want to know the origins, the provenance of the products that they consume. It's going to become more local. I'm starting to see this right now. I went out yesterday to celebrate my birthday, and in the menu it talked about the local sources that were used to provide the food that I ate. It's going to become far more dynamic. So what? By the way, it's going to require a new supply chain, but more importantly, a new supply chain manager, which means, are you ready for this change? Can you take advantage of the opportunities that these 7 macro trends empower, expose, and offer you? And by the way, that's the challenge that we in APICS at the Board of Directors are exploring now. But before I turn things over for questions, let me remind you what I said at the beginning. This is a forecasting exercise, and we all know that all forecasts are wrong. So finally, I will ask for questions, but before I ask for questions, if you have any questions, contacts that you'd like to talk with me about, please feel free to contact me. I'm at the Department of Supply Chain Management. I'm at 517-432-6410 and at melnick@msu.edu. Now, I'm open for questions.
Great. Great, thanks, Steve. As Steve just mentioned, now is the start of our Q&A, and so we'll give you a few minutes to send in your questions. If you forgot how to do that, there should be a questions box on your toolbar, and you can just submit your questions there. And so we'll give everybody a few minutes to do that.
For those of you experiencing audio problems, I apologize. We are working on that.
Yeah, it sounded pretty good. We had some problems in the beginning, but I think we've got better with it. So thank you to those of you who bared with us through all of that time. All right, Steve, well, here's our first question. How will companies be able to obtain the capital to afford to prepare for all these macro developments? Jason asks because it looks pretty expensive to do, so how should we come up with that capital?
By the way, Jason, you've asked a very good question, and let me tell you why it's an excellent question. The government has now realized the challenges that you're facing. Are you aware of the Revitalizing American Manufacturing Initiative? That's a piece of legislation that was passed by the government December of 2013, and it was unique because it was bipartisan, almost universal support. And one of the things that's happened is the government has realized that a lot of these new developments require a new infrastructure. And so what's now happening is there's a new development called NIST has been given the opportunity to work with coalitions of private and public institutions at helping small to medium-sized enterprises and large enterprises make the investments necessary. So the answer to your question in part is, number one, we're starting to see the fact that you have to make these investments, and that means you're going to have to go out and invest, and that means going to your bank. But number two, the government is becoming aware of this, and it's now working on providing sources of support to help you make the transition. So in fact, you've asked a good question. By the way, before I finish with Jason's question, one observation. If anyone has a chance, please read the AMP 2.0 report that was published by a blue ribbon panel and presented to the President. This report is critical because it identifies the challenges you're facing, and it makes recommendations to the government about how to invest to help businesses overcome these challenges. And I'll make a final statement that Michigan State University is in the process of submitting a grant as part of this initiative to fund an Institute for Supply Chain Innovation. And if any of you out there are interested in working with us, send me an email. This is a great time because this is a problem not unique to you, and there are going to be opportunities for funding available.
Well,
next one.
Great. So the next question is, what is the typical time horizon for that strategic response cycle that you outlined?
No, that's a good question. Thank you, whoever asked that. The reason I think it's a great question is because in the past we used to think about that time horizon as being months. That time horizon is falling to weeks. I'll give you a good example. As part of the Beyond the Horizon project, we visited a company in the Midwest, and they're in the fashion business, and they pointed out an automated packing, unpacking line, extremely sophisticated, represented a $1.5 million investment. I asked the manager who was taking us through, and I said, how long did it take you to go to that? And he made the following observation. He said, from the time we discussed it, began discussing it, until you saw that line implemented was 7 months. That's how fast things are occurring. And I asked him, isn't that fast? Isn't that short? And his response was rather good. He said, understand, if we sat and thought about things, the competition would move beyond us. So we're starting to see instances of where this cycle is stated in weeks. That's why I talked about Zara. Zara's response cycle. Let me give you an idea how fast Zara is. This is in fashion clothing. Madonna in 2010 did a tour through Europe, a 4-week tour. By the time she got to the last week, there were women in the audience who were wearing direct knockoffs of her clothing. provided by Zara. Zara had gone from idea, concept, design, production to delivery in less than 3 weeks. That's speed. That's the new supply chain.
Great, thanks, Steve. We had a couple of people ask about your 7 macro developments overall. One person asked, which do you think is the most important of these? And another asked, which do you think is the least likely to happen?
That's a good question. The reason we focused on these 7 is because I think many of them are already happening. I'm going to make a statement. If you go back, let me go back through these developments. If you go back through these developments, sorry about this, people. If you go back through these developments and you think about what's happening, aging of the developed countries is a certainty. Cybersecurity is a certainty. Autonomous and digital technologies is a certainty. Internet of Things is a certainty. Shifting of purchasing power to the east is a certainty. I would say the 2 that I would have some concerns about are the experiential and energy volatility. But if you look at all 7 of them, the foundations are there right now, and we're starting to see it. So the answer to your question is, if I was to bet, I would put my money on all of these developments taking place. So it's not a good answer. That's one reason why when I discussed them, I tried to discuss them as an entity as a whole rather than decoupling them, because they really interact with each other. And if you think about it, the conditions for all 7 are present right now. So it's kind of not an issue of if, it's going to be a condition of when.
Thanks, Steve. Our next question comes from Sabine. Sabine once says that she didn't understand how 3D printing can resolve Amazon's desire to build closer to the market. Can you explain that again and how that works?
Sure. Think about the traditional situation Amazon is faced by. Products come in from China. They have to be warehoused, and then they have to be delivered. Now, if you think about that, that's a lot of time and that's a lot of cost, right? You've got to warehouse them. You've got to have floor space. You've got to have inventory on hand. You've got to worry about moving products in. Well, think about what happens is instead of having the products in stock, I have the designs and I have the raw materials. And then what happens is as the truck is coming towards you, what it's doing is it's downloading the design for your order, it's using the raw materials, and it's printing the product as it's on the truck. Now notice what I've done. Instead of having finished goods sitting in inventory, now understand, if you're an inventory person, everyone knows what the problem of having finished goods sitting in inventory. They age, they get damaged, they become obsolete. They also disappear. Now what you're doing is you're stocking raw material, and as the customer order is coming in, you're building it to the order. By the way, if you think this is unique to Amazon, I was last year at an Air Force maintenance base, and the Air Force is now exploring the possibility of using 3D printing to make critical components for itself. So instead of having very large, costly warehouses, it can print parts as needed. So think about what happens. You're going from finished goods, which have quick serviceability, but a high probability of not being right. That's why we have buffer stocks and we have forecast errors, to having raw material, but with 3D printing I can convert those raw materials quickly to finished goods. And if you're on Amazon, think about what that means in terms of inventory investment. The best example of this is, how many of you have ever worked with iTunes? Have you noticed that iTunes has no inventory? The only time it has inventory is when you place the order. Isn't that neat? 3D printing enables us to bring to physical products the iTunes experience. Next one.
Actually, that's all the questions we have time for today, so thank you very much to everybody for participating. If your question was not answered or you think of more questions later, please feel free to reach out to Steve. Steve, can you share your contact info one more time?
Okay, my contact information again, just to show you where let me just, let's go back. Bang, bang, bang. Back there.
That's the one.
Stephen A. Melnick, 517-432-6410, or at melnick@msu.edu. And by the way, to everyone who's been here, thank you very much. And don't forget to please give me feedback so we can figure out how we can make this such presentations better for you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Steve, and thank you to everybody in our audience. This concludes today's edition of APICS Extra Live. All content and materials included in this edition of APICS Extra Live are the property of APICS and Dr. Stephen A. Melnick and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Have a great day.